Every once in a while on this channel, I'm going to get a comment that makes me go, And it's fun because I post these videos really because I'm trying to solicit your guys' feedback as to what you think of Robert E. Howard and Conan and other material, because I'm only really coming at this from my point of view and what I've read. I carry my own baggage to the reading. So when I'm getting your comments, it makes me step back and go, I've never thought of that way before. And it's really eye-opening for me, and I enjoy that. One of the comments I got the other day was a question, though, that made me go, I have never thought about that before. And then made me go, either that question is a moment of pure genius or it's a moment of pure insanity. I don't know which one it is, but I love it. Here's the question that came to me. It was, Tennessee Fats, if you had only one issue of Savage Sword of Conan to read, what would it be? By the way, in case you're curious, this is how I type, like a platypus. And I went, I have no freaking clue. So little OCD Tennessee Fats, the ones in the back of my head that's always pissing me off, went down the stairs, and he went down to the basement to the boiler, and he went to the little wood burning stove beside it, started poking at the embers. He poke. And he's saying, what's the answer? What is it? Speak to me, embers. Give me the knowledge. And then he came running back upstairs, and he screamed at me, and he said, this is the answer. And I went, solid choice. Here's what I chose. Savage Sword of Conan, number 176. Now, I tell you, most of you are going to look at this, and you're going to say, seriously? This is your choice. This. It is. 3 reasons why this is my choice, okay? 1, I have a personal relationship with this copy of this book, okay? I'm going to disclose that right now. This book and I have a relationship. 2, I'm a big fan of what if. I think that's fairly obvious in the take I take on most things. When I'm looking at a story, the little OCD version of me oftentimes will pick at the threads in it and say, well, what happens here? What happens here? What happens here? I think the biggest what if has always been Tom Bombadil. Who the fridge is that guy? Conversation for another day. But you pick at these things. And the funny part about picking at these is there's never a wrong answer. You can literally say, well, what if here? And you can come with anything you want. It's a beautiful way to build off of somebody else's IP. And it's also a beautiful way to really drill down on who the character is. I have a lot of fun with that. So when I find a Savage Sword of Conan that has not 1, not 2, but 3 what ifs, all about Conan, you have my attention. The last aspect of this, which was really speaking to me when I was a young collector, was the art in this changes per theme. Yeah, I know. We're going to go through the book and I'm going to show you how that happens. And many of you are going to say, but Tennessee Fats, it's not even a Buscema channel. Trust me. We're going to get to it. So I'm not going to tell you at the end of this whether you should buy it or not, because it's obviously my favorite, so you should. But I am going to say, what is your answer to this question? Think about it. And then tippity below once we get there. Everybody, let's get into the book. Okay, so earlier I used the phrase relationship. Now, I think that might be slightly stretching it, but in my own mind, that's how I justify this, okay? We're going to go with this. And I was actually contemplating whether I would actually consider this aspect of the book in the video or not. But then I looked at the question. The question was, Tennessee Fats, which one would you choose? Well, this is the one I would choose. So here we go. It's part of the reason why, so I'm giving you the rationale. So there's clearly an emotional tie to this. And the emotional tie for me comes from the fact that this book was in the stack, the bundle of 5 Conan magazines that I found in a convenience store outside of North Bay way back in 1991. I was literally on my way up to a cottage with my grandparents. I was going to be in the middle of nowhere for weeks on end with no access to television or anything else that would possibly amuse me. But since I read comic books, my grandparents were nice enough to stop at a convenience store to see what I could find. Maybe there'd be something for me to take and read with me. And I found magazines. I didn't even know Conan magazines really existed at that point in time. I picked up Conan comic books off the rack in my local convenience store to my house, and I even went into a comic shop where I picked up Conan comic books there. But the magazines were just something I'd never seen. They just weren't there. So when I saw these in the magazine rack in that particular convenience store, I grabbed a bundle. And it's interesting, I believe if I remember correctly, I had 2 Savage Sword of Conans and 3 Conan sagas. And it's interesting because obviously nobody else had been buying these, because I know when I'm looking back at these, I can see the earlier issues that I picked up were from almost a full year before. So they've been sitting on that rack for a long time. So I had these. And I went out and I was fairly isolated out in this cottage in the middle of nowhere where obviously you have fishing and everything else you could possibly need. But at night you go to bed, you read before you go to bed. At least I always do. And I would sit there and I would read these by the little wood-burning stove on the sofa in the living room. And I tell you, it was interesting. Really eye-opening experience for me because that was the first time I really got to see Buscema art in black and white. And that was the first time that I really got to experience Roy Thomas writing in a single story that was screaming that level of quality. It was even the Conan Saga issues. But this is the one that stuck with me the most. And it's an interesting one because there's nothing really particular about this issue that you would think would scream to a teenage comic collector. Really, there isn't. It's a unique one. It's got some interesting story and art that I'm going to talk about later, which is why this is one of my favorites. But to a teenager, you would think these things aren't really going to sink in and actually credibly hook them. But it did. And it's interesting. I go back to this book, and I probably read this book and reread it annually, probably at least once a year. I get this one out to read it once again, just to remember one of those formative things that introduced me to the character. And in that way, I do have a relationship with this book. This book right here, this newsstand copy, which is, the cover is faded. It's not in great condition by any means. The interior pages are yellowed because, well, back then I didn't have any magazine bags, so these things were just sitting on my shelf. So it aged. It aged like most Conan magazines would. But at the same time, it's phenomenally valuable to me because I look back at this and I remember that trip and I remember reading this and where I was in that space in my head at the time. And this book, for some reason, just speaks to me. It reminds me of those formative times. So for me, I'm somewhat biased to this book for that reason. So I'm throwing this one in as reason one, okay? I'm throwing it right out there to begin with. So you guys know I'm biased to this. And maybe when you pick your own books, you're biased for a similar reason, and that's okay. All right, let's talk about the actual writing, and we'll talk about the story itself. And for this part, we'll flip it around and we'll look at the book. Okay, now let's talk about the book itself. Now, I've already talked about my personal bias to this, but let's go back to the actual content. Now, I said earlier that this is really cool for really two intellectual reasons to me. The one is the fact that it's got those 3 what-if stories in it. And the other is the art that's thematic as you go through the story. So let's go through both of those when we flip through the book here. Now, you'll see my copy here. As I said, the cover is somewhat faded, but I don't care. To me, this is still an important book to me, and I'm going to keep it for that reason. Try to get it right here in one piece. Obviously, you want to keep it in one piece, regardless of whether you're collecting it or not. So the cover art, it's Earl Norm art on the cover, which honestly, this to me screams Conan cover art. When I look at Conan cover art, Earl Norm is who I'm really looking for on covers. The guy's detail and his real focus on the fantasy sort of epic storytelling really does it for me. And the other thing that I really like about his art is generally it matches the story. He does a good job of actually saying, how am I going to create something that's going to actually go with the internal story? So here you got Conan, you got some monsters in the background, all sorts of different sort of things where you're looking at it going, I don't know what those are. You got this crazy witch guy over here, he's got cards on the floor, and cobras just, I don't know, hanging out and looking at him. And he's got a weird chicken arm. And all those things actually come out in the story. So let's flip around in here. So you guys can look up who the actual artists and writers are on this for yourself. The fact of the matter is, I've already said, it's not Buscema, it's not Ernie Chan, it's not a Roy Thomas. It is a story that is an independent one. And it starts with basically Conan trying to break into this castle to steal a stone. That is, I guess it's a magical stone, but a lot of people don't realize it's magical. He's just trying to break in and steal the stone just because he wants to be able to sell it. And you've got this massive Gothic splash page in here. And this is, again, something to a young comic collector, and it still speaks to me today that you have this level of giant epic scene setting in a magazine, which you don't get in a comic, but at the same time, you also don't get this in all of the magazines. So I really like the way this is included. There's the stone, by the way, that he's going after. There's a lot of dialogue in here, and I don't really want to spoil the majority of the dialogue in it. But the bottom line is, you have this witch guy who lives in the castle that's guarding the stone, and he uses the stone to see the future. And he also uses the stone and cards to see specific futures of other people. And he's obviously some sort of weird demon mutant thing, or hybrid, because look, he's got a hand, and then he's got a chicken arm. And Conan rushes him, and he knows who Conan is when he comes in. He actually says, you know, you are Conan the Cimmerian, right? And he casts a spell that holds him in place. And because he's a bored, lonely guy, he says, well, you know what, Conan, here's what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to, because, well, this is more dialogue, but we're not going to go into this because I don't want to spoil it for you guys. He says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay out these cards for you here. And in these are going to tell us 3 false futures for you. And the 4th one, or the last one, is going to be real. He doesn't actually say the fourth one, but he says 3 are going to be false and 1's going to be real. And the way the story reads is you actually go through 3 stories as you're clicking along. Now, the story obviously is called The Many Deaths or The 3 Deaths of Conan. And what he does in here is he starts flipping them over and he starts telling Conan the stories of, this is your ultimate fate. Because I guess the cards are going right to the end, not to how he gets there, but just to the end point. And this is where we see the first transition I talked about earlier, where we go into now, we're getting into either this is going to be his true fate or it's a what if, and you're getting an art shift. Because you'll notice over here you have one art style, and then the very next page it completely changes. It changes the theme and the tone of the story. And in the story, Conan is actually up in the mountainous ranges, just basically east of Samaria, where he's got himself caught in a border skirmish. He's being led out into the mountains, and as he's going there, you can see the brutality as they're cutting a bunch of captives loose that have slipped and are falling off the cliff. And Conan's going to survive. And they're laughing at him, saying, well, you might wish you were with them actually later on. And it's interesting because in here, you start to see a couple of references where the authors, and this is a writing point to the story which gives it a nice theme, starts to claw back and draw to H.P. Lovecraft sort of stories. For example, this city was built by the cult of Sodatha, who is, Yog-Sothoth? Anyways, he's an H.P. Lovecraft character that's used in Marvel, which is interesting because they start to draw these things in. So as a young reader or a reader who knows anything about H.P. Lovecraft, you're hearing the name and like, oh, I know where we're going with this. And you're thinking you're getting something sinister. Well, I'm not going to ruin the whole story for you. There's a witch queen there. Things happen once again. Conan becomes the Hyborian Age gigolo. And at the end of the day, he ends up getting thrown in a pit because everybody's like, oh, the pit, because this is what they do with captives. And the witch queen is saying, no, it's, I use the pits to keep the local tribes here in check because I amuse them. Conan's tossed in the pit after he's been drugged, and there's a giant monster. Now, this is the giant monster that you saw on the cover. The big one in the background. Here, I'll flip it over and I'll show you. See, there he is right there. And the story is Conan is fighting this thing, but obviously he's unarmed and he's drugged. So obviously things are not going to go well for him. And as much as he's fighting and he's poking its eyes out and they're saying it's the longest battle that's ever happened, well, he dies. He gets eaten. Interesting because, you read Conan comics, Conan never dies. Well, at least he doesn't die to the point where he can't be brought back. Or, sorry, it's a very fuzzy line, okay? But Conan doesn't die. That's the point. But somehow in this, he is. So you're running into a story where you're like, oh, he dies. But then again, this guy's saying, well, this is going to be your ultimate fate, or I'm going to kill you and put your head in one of my jars. And it's kind of interesting, like, okay, is this the what if, or is this the actual true fate? And he's going to get out of this story with this guy, who's unnamed throughout the whole story, by the way. He says, well, you know what, I'm not going to keep you in suspense. Let's go with the next story. And once again, you transition easily. Here's those snakes that were looking at him. By the way, I hate snakes. They're looking at him while he's reading the cards. How he does that, I don't know. And again, you have an art transitioning now. And the art is transitioning now to a much more, it's detailed, it's gritty, it's dirty. You just saw very clean lines in this story over here, right? Like these are very clean art lines. The inking is done very well and with very little shading. And now you're shifting over to something that's got a lot of shading, and the detail that goes into it says, okay, this is potentially going to be more of a darker story. And this story is actually one of Dagon, another H.P. Lovecraft proprietary piece of IP. And Conan finds his way after a shipwreck. He's starving. He makes his way into a town. He buys himself some ale. The harbor town is, really, really deserted, and everybody's sort of strange. And they explain, most people have left town. I'm not going to ruin the story, but the cult of Dagon ends up trying to kidnap Conan and basically the woman, because again, Conan is always the Hyborian Age gigolo that he's with. But look at the detailing, look at the grittiness. Like, I'm shooting this in 4K. You guys can just freeze the frame at any point in time here and zoom in, and just the blood and gore in this, just to show the darkness. Now, Dagon, again, H.P. Lovecraft, character that, if I remember the story quite well, actually is a water dweller, or at least that's where he's worshipped. Quite interesting here that you go through this and basically you get the intonation that Dagon, who's right here, hates all things above land. And Conan, even though he's not personally tied to this woman, decides he's going to jump in and be the superhero of this. Oh, I'm going to jump into basically a crowd of hundreds of these worshippers and somehow, and fight Dagon at the same time. And somehow I'm going to survive, as he's seen other people being captured and then brainwashed by basically having their brains flushed out by Dagon with a claw thing. And he jumps in and says, Crom, count the dead. And at the end of it, he is captured and once again, curse you. And again, the other fate here being he's now going to become a brain dead Dagon worshiper. Again, are we now with the real story or the fake story? Who knows, right? And the art style shifts back because now you're back and he's basically taunting him, saying, you know, these are the stories. Let's get to the third one here before we get to the last one. And again, art style shifts again. Not clean, not over detailed and gritty, but a darker theming art style where you have a story where Conan is in a battle, and it's a massive battle where he's in the last stand, he's been surrounded by people, and unfortunately he gets knocked out as he's with his small group in the last stand. And I gather what happens is he's left for dead. They always make the comment in these things when they club Conan over the back of the head that he's got a hard skull. I guess that means something, because he wakes up, he's got arrows in his back, but he's alive, and he thinks, oh, he hears something, and he finds out that what's actually there are ghouls. Ghouls are, again, they're eating the flesh, and again, another dark reference here. And there are ghouls in other Robert E. Howard material. Can't remember the name of the forest that's down in Argos, where it's the forest of the ghouls, or the ghoul forest. Anyways, but again, common theme in Robert E. Howard, and it's being drawn in here, that there are ghouls basically eating the dead on the plains. Conan here, again, is not just going to be smart and say, I'm out of here. He decides to aggressively go and attack. And you know, you're surrounded by ghouls. You're already wounded. He gets a gut spear, and you know, that's a long death. And lo and behold, guess what? He's dead. His head's cut off and left on a spike, and the ghouls have harvested everything shiny and eaten his flesh. At the end of the day, it cuts back again with the art style right in the same page. Here's the one art style that we just saw for that darker, grittier thing, coming back to the thematic first style we saw when he was breaking into the castle, where again you've got this witchman. And again, witchman guy is saying, you know, the last one, obviously, because these three we've already had are going to be the true one. This is one where I'm going to cut your head off, which will be very interesting. But at the same time, he's saying, but actually, I wonder if you're not going to have your head cut off today. So he's even starting to sense, maybe I'm down to the last one here. Kind of odd. But as he's been yammering this whole time, his spell's been weakening because, well, he's been gloating and not really paying attention. Conan takes a dagger and throws it, and it hits him right in the mouth. He falls back on his jars of heads that he's collected, which is another part of the sub-story. And then all the promises that he's made, where he's absorbed pieces of dark gods in himself to make him more powerful, come out. And they think about attacking Conan, and Conan's like, okay, listen, guys, I've seen my death 3 times today. If you want me, come and get me. And they just back off and say, yeah, this one isn't for taking. We'll just leave now. And they leave the whole place covered in ooze, which is a weird one. And Conan finds the last card. And he says to himself, well, hold on, I've seen 3 fates, all that have me dying horribly. Do I really want to flip it over? And lo and behold, he does. And he laughs riotously, because the card shows him sitting on the crown, on the throne, which is where he becomes King Conan. Fascinating that the last card draws back into what we all know is going to happen to Conan when he becomes a king. Again, you have 3 what-if stories in here, and then the ultimate one, which is where he becomes King Conan later, because he's in his younger years here, obviously, because, you know, he's just running around being a thief. So, nice what-if stories, but again, with the what-if stories, they were entirely believable. Yes, Conan would jump in there and just fight instead of, you know, being intelligent in some cases and just saying, I'm out of here. Yes, he would go in there and aggressively try to handle things the way he did. He would probably fall into being drugged by that witch queen and then being thrown into the pit. There's all these things that are common to the character that kind of fit, so none of them are really wrong. Again, the art shifts as you're going. So when the art's shifting, you're getting a sense of the theme changing. You're getting a sense of the tone changing. You're getting a sense of Lovecraft in 2 of the stories coming in different ways with different particular Lovecraft characters or gods that are being drawn in, where you're going, I know I'm going to get this sort of feel out of this, or I'm going to get that sort of feel out of that. Very interesting the way it's all drawn in that way. And to me, as now an adult comic reader, this actually says more to me now than it did back when I was a teen. So the stories, yeah, you know, they were interesting and they resonated on some sort of level. It made me keep this book and think about this book and come back to it on a regular basis. But years later, and coming back to it, it was like, these show different aspects of Conan that I never would have caught otherwise. Even though they all lead to his demise, other than the last one, of course, they do show aspects of the character which would readily get him killed if he's out there just willy-nilly following these all the time. So for me, as I say, personal issues and personal connection to this book aside, these other 2 aspects where you get to go through 3 what-if stories that are very typical and very picturesque of the character, with the art styles that transition with them, this to me just seems to be, I think, one of my, it is literally my top, and this is the one Savage Sword of Conan book you should read. And I'll tell you, the one thing that still kicks with me to this day, and we're going to go back to it here, the art on this daggone story, just over the top detail and crazy. Look at the toes, for crying out loud. Like, just phenomenal stuff. This is one where I literally spend hours just looking at the panel, just going, look at the detail they put into this. Phenomenal work. Anyways, everybody, let's get back to the wrap up and the question I'm going to pose to you. And we're back. Now, I'll tell you, what I liked about this video was it was one where I really got a chance to answer one of your questions. And I got to do it in such a way where I got to look back at a book that I've really enjoyed for a long, long time. Obviously, I have an emotional connection to this book and that point in time in my life. I can't lie about that. That's clearly here, and I've disclosed it clearly. But the question was, which one would I choose? So that's part of my choice. What I also like about this book is the fact that you have 3 different takes on Conan the Barbarian, who's a Robert E. Howard piece of IP, but at the same time, it's a Robert E. Howard piece of IP that's changed over time. It's a character where there's been a lot of build off of, where we now have more of a sense of a story that's outside of just the Robert E. Howard original stories. Obviously, those are the canon. I'm not going to argue with that. But what I like with these stories are they're clearly not canon. That's blatantly obvious in the writing. But they give you very clear vignettes into Conan's thought process, into who he is, into what he does, and why he is what he is. Very interesting. 3 of them led to his death. Fascinating how the 3 that just lead to his death don't occur in his natural progression of life as is written by Robert E. Howard. These ones are clear where it's like, no, he does this, he dies. He does this, he dies. Robert E. Howard just continues to come on and he does it just fine. So clearly, he has some sense of control in it, but in the what ifs, well, what if? Everybody, this one is my takeaway. What I want you guys to do now is step back and say to yourself, well, if I could only choose one Savage Sword of Conan comic, which one would it be and why? Tippity it down below. If you want to do something more detailed, you want to send me an email, feel free. I get them and I do respond. Everybody, I hope you enjoyed this video. We'll see you in the next one. Have yourself a great day.